Let's begin with sensory receptors, including the receptive field and processing and interpretation. Sensory receptors are the initial component of our sensory systems. They respond to a stimulus and perform sensory transduction. They're specialized transducers of energy and information from our environment. As part of the peripheral nervous system, sensory nerves transmit information to the central nervous system. Sensory receptors are classified based on their location, their morphology or shape, and the rate of adaptation or function over time. The special senses of the body are vision, smell or olfaction, taste or gustation, hearing, and equilibrium. Sensory receptors have what's known as sensory receptive fields. The simplest type of sensory receptor are dendrites of the sensory neurons, and these are known as free nerve endings. The receptive field of a sensory neuron is the physical region of space where a stimulus must occur to trigger that neuron to fire. This is depicted in this figure. The receptive field for the retinal cell is a cone shape. When light falls within the cone, that particular cell is activated. However, when light falls around or near the receptive field, that particular cell does not fire an action potential. The receptor generator potential. The receptor generator potential is defined as the response a sensory nerve cell has to stimulation at the receptor, whose change in membrane potential is proportional to the strength of the stimulus. The change in membrane potential, or the transduction of bioelectric energy, is called the generator potential. This is illustrated in the figure to the right. The intensity of the stimulus, i.e. the amount of light in this example, impacts the receptor generator potential, which leads to different frequencies of action potentials. As more light stimulates this retinal cell, this results in an increased frequency of generation of action potentials, and these are depicted as red spikes. The interpretation of sensory information. Sensory receptors differ in their adaptation to a stimulus, or in other words, how long they will transmit action potentials once they're stimulated. They are classified based on adaptation rates as A, tonic, or B, phasic receptors. Tonic receptors adapt slowly to the stimulus, and therefore they produce and transmit action potentials over a period of time. An example of a tonic receptor would be a pain receptor. Phasic receptors. These react and adapt quickly to the stimulus and do not produce action potentials over time after a single stimulus. An example of a phasic receptor would be a mechanoreceptor, such as those in the skin, that would respond to stimuli such as pressure. The conscious awareness of a stimulus is involved in central adaptation. Central adaptation refers to adaptation to a stimulus that takes place inside the central nervous system. The conscious awareness of the stimulus, such as a smell, almost completely disappears over time. The process involves the inhibition of nuclei along the particular sensory pathway, and this leads to a reduction in sensory input to the cerebral cortex of the brain, and therefore a decrease in noticing or conscious awareness of the stimulus. Here's a clinical challenge exam question based on what you've learned so far in this tutorial. Sensory receptors monitor the internal and external environment and initiate the transmission of this information to the central nervous system. Which of the following statements about sensory receptors is correct? A. Sensory receptors transmit motor impulses to the central nervous system. B. Tonic receptors adapt slowly to the stimulus. C. Phasic receptors adapt slowly to the stimulus. D. The sensory receptive field is the zone the stimulus must not be inside, but around, to activate the receptor. Or E. Sensory receptors are only classified on their location in the body. Here's the answer to this question. This question tests your knowledge of the sensory receptors in the body. The correct answer for this question was B. Tonic receptors adapt slowly to the stimulus. The general receptors in our bodies can be divided into 4 categories. These receptors can sense stimuli such as pain and changes in temperature. Based on the type of stimuli that excites the receptor, these are the 4 groups: nociceptors, thermoreceptors, mechanoreceptors, and chemoreceptors. The skin, for example, contains 4 types of sensory receptors. The first type of general receptor we'll discuss are nociceptors. These are also known as pain receptors. They're located in the skin, muscle, and joints. The cell bodies of nociceptors are typically located in dorsal root ganglia and develop from neural crest cells. Nociceptors are organized into thermal, which are activated by extreme heat or cold temperatures, mechanical, which are activated by mechanical damage, and receptors that are sensitive to chemicals. Based on the large receptive field of nociceptors, it's difficult to pinpoint the exact location of the origin of pain. Referred pain. Pain can be sensed by nociceptors and classified as fast or slow pain. Fast pain is produced by a small injury, for example, a deep cut. Depending on the type of injury, this may or may not be followed by slow pain. Slow pain is more of an aching pain that lasts longer. For example, a deep cut in the finger would produce initial fast pain. This would then be followed by a longer, aching, slow pain. When pain is present in a visceral organ, for example, such as the heart, it can be perceived in the more superficial region that's innervated by the same spinal nerve. This is why during a heart attack, the victim feels pain in the chest, left arm, and shoulder region. The pain in the arm would be known as referred pain. The following is a clinical note on pain. Pain is a common occurrence that can result from damage to tissue or the irritation of a sensory nerve. Pain can be characterized as acute or chronic, and the treatment is tailored to the particular type in some cases. Acute pain is usually caused by tissue damage and involves a release of fatty acids from damaged cell membranes and the activation of nociceptors. With chronic pain, it's difficult to identify the cause and difficult to treat. Chronic pain can occur after an injury that has healed, from a disease, and in some cases with no apparent cause. The treatment for acute pain includes the use of analgesics and anti-inflammatories. Chronic pain treatment includes analgesics, narcotic pain medication, drugs that target nerves, neuropathic drugs, and in some cases, surgical procedures. Surgery for chronic pain involves altering the pain pathway, such as targeting the dorsal roots, a rhizotomy, or deep brain stimulation. The second group of general receptors we'll discuss are thermoreceptors. Thermoreceptors detect changes in temperature. An example would be sensory receptors in the skin. Thermoreceptors are also found in skeletal muscle, liver, and in the hypothalamus. In general, there are more cold receptors than warm receptors, and the temperature sensations are transmitted on the same pathways that transmit pain. Temperature sensations are transmitted to the reticular formation, the thalamus, and some to the somatosensory cortex. Mechanoreceptors. Mechanoreceptors respond to and detect compression, twisting, or distortion of the receptor plasma lemma. These receptors are located in the skin, joints, and tendons, and in the walls of blood vessels, such as baroreceptors in the arch of the aorta. Baroreceptors detect the blood pressure that flows past them and the impact this has on vessel diameter. The skin in our bodies is unique in that it has 4 different types of mechanoreceptors. Meissner's corpuscles. These mechanoreceptor nerve endings are in the skin. They're large, oval, tactile corpuscles that are encapsulated receptors. They're rapidly adapting receptors and responsible for the feeling of not noticing your clothes shortly after you put them on. Merkel cells. These are tactile discs that are unencapsulated. They're found in the skin and mucous membranes. They're the most sensitive sensory receptors in the skin and allow our fingertips to discriminate fine objects. Pacinian corpuscles. These are mechanoreceptors found in the dermis of the skin, and they're activated when the skin is rapidly indented. They're also known as lamellated corpuscles, and they're large encapsulated receptors. The fourth type of mechanoreceptors in the skin are Ruffini's endings. These are slow adapting mechanoreceptors, and they're found in the dermis. They're sensitive to skin stretch and are activated when items slip out of the hand. These receptors are tonically active, but they do not typically show adaptation. Baroreceptors. These receptors monitor changes in pressure. They're located in the walls of blood vessels and hollow organs. As the pressure changes inside a blood vessel or hollow organ, the elastic walls either stretch, which is an increase in pressure, or recoil, a decrease in pressure. An example of these type of mechanoreceptors are baroreceptors located in major blood vessels. In the arch of the aorta in the aortic sinus, they provide sensory information about changes in blood pressure to the cardiac center. This leads to changes in heart rate to accommodate the change in blood pressure. Proprioceptors. Proprioception is the sense of the position of a body part relative to the rest of the body. Proprioceptors are mechanical receptors that monitor position of body parts, the tension in tendons, and the state of muscular contraction. A Golgi tendon organ, as depicted in this image, is a proprioceptive sensory receptor that transmits the sensory information to the spinal cord for processing. During a tendon reflex, for example, such as the patellar reflex, a Golgi tendon organ responds to stretching and delivers the sensory impulse to the central nervous system. Chemoreceptors. These are sensitive to chemical stimuli in their region or location. Chemoreceptors are located in the medulla oblongata, the aorta, and the carotid arteries. At the junction of the internal carotid arteries, in the carotid body, chemoreceptors monitor blood circulation. These chemoreceptors detect changes in blood oxygenation and carbon dioxide levels in the blood. And this information is then transmitted to the central nervous system through the cranial nerve, the glossopharyngeal nerve.